If the Australian government is, as the critics suggest, spending like a drunken sailor, how big will be our hangover relative to our spendthrift major trading partners, such as the big spender of them all and global economic pace setter, the United States? Its deficit could exceed 2.3 trillion Australian dollars, or 11% of GDP this year, as opposed to our 2%. Its net public debt predicted to reach 60% of GDP by the end of next year. So sadly, disaster looms.
I'm pledging to cut the deficit we inherited by half by the end of my first term in office.
Very interestingly, that's an exact repeat of a statement made by George W. Bush at the beginning of his second term.
Thank you.
Mr. Obama will have to confront not just tough decisions on spending, but also very unpleasant choices about taxation. There'll be pressure on him from his own party, the Democrats, to slash defense spending after the increases we had during the Bush years. And he may have to confront some very, very unpopular tax choices.
The one advantage that the US has that no other country does is that all of its debts are in its own currency, and the US is the source of the US dollars in which the US's debts are denominated.
So they can print money.
In an extreme circumstance, they can print money without suffering the consequences that other countries might do in those circumstances.
And when we go back to printing money, we hope it doesn't have the same damaging effects as when that was done in the 1970s, when it produced a whole lot of inflation.
The UK's deficit is set to reach 10% of GDP, with no option to print money to ease its inevitable pain.
Well, the UK is in a worse position than the United States in two respects. One, its financial sector is relatively much larger than that of the United States. Secondly, that a lot of the obligations that the UK government is taking on are not in its own currency, but rather are in foreign currencies.
When we get a new government in Britain in 2010, maybe a Conservative government at that point, it'll have a very difficult first 1 or 2 years in office trying to reduce the fiscal deficit, trying to achieve any other goals it might set in the coming election campaign.
So the British too must brace for higher taxes when what they really need is the reverse, as will Australia's largest trading partners, the Japanese, whose predicament is even worse. With exports plummeting, unemployment rising, nowhere to move on interest rates, a political system in ferment, and the tax base and labour force declining with a rapidly ageing population.
Well, I think Japan's problems are very, very serious, potentially intractable, and there's no way to predict right now exactly how it'll play out.
Its net debt to GDP ratio is sort of in the 90s, like it's sort of almost 100% of GDP.
So, in the big picture, it seems, the world is an amazing mess.
We face short-term crises in Austria, in Greece, in Ireland, the Ukraine, and a number of Baltic countries where the governments teeter on bankruptcy. There are a large number of countries which are in problems, and I don't think your program is long enough for us to talk about them all.
But amidst the gloom, and despite its own downturn, one glimmer of hope, according to economists we spoke to, is our second largest trading partner, China, particularly after its $600 billion stimulus package.
The fiscal stimulus has been massive by comparison with other countries. Chinese government has been talking about and delivering fiscal stimulus on the scale of 13% of GDP. That's 3 times bigger relative to the size of their economy than what's been contemplated here in Australia.
I think the numbers are big enough that these policy actions should, by the third or fourth quarter of this year, bring China's growth rate back to 8%. And that's, of course, very important for Australia.
So the aftershocks of the global economic crisis will be many. The lucky country, relatively resilient, bobbing about like a cork in heavy seas.